Hello, everyone, and welcome to my Microcosm project. Over the last 8 weeks, we've had the opportunity to make our own microcosm. We collected mud or dirt from some sort of body of water. We placed it in some sort of vessel, and over the last 8 weeks, we've observed, taken notes, made a log, and I'm really excited to share my results with you guys. That being said, I think 8 weeks was enough. Any longer, I think my girlfriend was going to kill me. She was tired of seeing the dirty water jars on the windowsill. So with that being said, let's jump right into it. So I think the first question everybody is asking themselves is, why the heck would I ever do a microcosm or make a microcosm? And I think it's important for a lot of people to. Not just ecology, but in the fields of biology and even physics. I think it would be instrumental in some experiments. That being said, why should we do a microcosm or make a microcosm? The answer is rooted in simplification. It takes something so large like an ecosystem and magnifies it and makes it more palatable. We get to see the inner workings at a much smaller scale. And I think that's important. The second thing is being able to predict and understand things. Instead of observing a whole ecosystem, we can take a much more concentrated portion of it and really learn in depth. The third thing I think it's important is efficiency. You're not trying to manipulate a whole ecosystem. You're just trying to hold controls on a small jar. And I think that, once again, makes this a more conducive experiment. And the last portion is research and education. I think that, like I said before, a lot of scientific disciplines can really benefit from the usage of microcosms. So for this experiment, I really had two hypotheses. The first was an explosion of life. I really anticipated the jars to really just boom with life at some point. And this was really centered around the plants. So in the project, we introduced some various forms of plants to the jars in the beginning. And I really figured that these plants would really be a haven for all kinds of organisms. They would not only produce oxygen, which most organisms need, but they would also provide a place to hide. They'd provide a food source themselves and maybe a breeding area. And they'd really foster a predator-prey interaction and really facilitate a life cycle inside the jars. My second hypothesis was that everything in the jars was going to die. I wasn't really sure what from, but I really did anticipate that water loss would be a major factor. With only a finite amount of water inside the jars, I figured evaporation would be a big killer. It turned out that it wasn't. But my hypothesis really centered around not only evaporation, but the plants releasing oxygen. And that oxygen introduced to the water would slowly raise the pH and really make the jars uninhabitable for most organisms. So for this experiment, we were asked to find a vessel, something that we could make our microcosm in. And myself, I'm an avid canner. So I have a garden, I can things, I keep them for the winter. And after that, I really don't know what to do with the jars. You're really not supposed to use them again for fear of botulism. So I have this surplus of glass mason jars, and I didn't know what to do with them. And well, lucky me, I was able to use a couple of them for this project. So for this project, I used 3 identical ball mason jars, 32 ounces. So with my jars in hand, I took a little trek down to a stream that crosses my property in Middletown, New York. For those of you that don't know, Middletown, New York is about an hour and some change up from the city. Um, so I've seen the stream many of times. I've seen some small river chubs and some sunfish in it, but I really wasn't sure what to expect. The water has already kind of gotten cold here, so I put some boots on. I grabbed a little cup, as you see there, and I kind of waded in the water and tried to find some muddy areas where I could scoop up a good portion of mud. I ended up taking mud from 3 different areas from the stream, all about I'd say 100 meters from each other. I then put about an inch to 2 inches of mud in each jar. And at the time, I didn't see anything. So I really wasn't sure what to expect. The next step was collecting plants. This proved to be a little more difficult. Like I said, the weather had kind of already turned here. And the stream isn't really, I wouldn't say it doesn't have a lot of plant life. It's just not a lot to really kind of harvest, especially small enough to put in a jar. So I did end up collecting a couple species. I wasn't sure if they were really the right species to put in the jar, but we grabbed a couple species of plants. I wasn't sure what they were at the time. It wasn't until I got home that I was able to kind of reverse image search some stuff and found out, that I had grabbed duckweed, tape grass, some water chess, and I think it was willow moss. So after collecting the plants, I took stream water from the areas which I collected and filled the jars to roughly the 26-ounce line. I wanted to leave some space for potential oxygen that the plants would produce. I really wasn't sure what was going to happen, so I wanted to leave some space. The next step wasn't mandatory, but I felt it was necessary to add an extra layer to the project, and that was collecting some sort of organism to put in the jar. Once again, the weather had already turned. I must have been in the stream for about an hour trying to find some sort of life. I ended up finding some fairy shrimp. There's a picture right here that kind of shows a fairy shrimp. Not the best, I know it's from an iPhone. But, I was able to scoop up around 6 of them, put 2 in each jar, and hoped that would be enough. So after I had put the shrimp in the jar, I took them home, I sealed them, and I placed them on my bathroom windowsill where they would spend the next 8 weeks. The reason I chose to put them indoors instead of outdoors is, once again, the temperature had already kind of turned here, and I wasn't sure how much longer it would be until temperatures really dropped below freezing. And I felt that if the jars froze, it would kind of completely void the experiment. This way, being inside, they would receive, indirect sunlight for 6 to 8 hours a day, and the temperature would be somewhat controlled. So this is a picture of my ugly mug after I had just collected everything. Yeah, I was a little concerned. As you can see from the picture, it looks very milky. And I wasn't sure how long it would really take for the sediment in the jars to settle. I don't know if you can really see from the prior picture, but the sediment was very fine. And it concerned me thinking that maybe this is what it would look like the whole 8 weeks. So this is a picture of the jars a week after I'd collected them. They were still murky, but they seemed to be clearing up. I hadn't seen the shrimp, and kind of my thoughts were I might have unintentionally killed them by milking up the jars. So I just had to kind of wait and see. After around 2 weeks, the water had completely cleared. As you can see in the pictures, I know the words are kind of blocking the last one, but the water is clear, and At the time, you could see the shrimp. I was thankful that they were all alive, and they looked to be living their best lives. No predators. They were swimming around. They really kind of established this as their new home. So, in week 3, nothing really changed. I kind of assumed maybe this would kind of be the high point of the project, and that I'd kind of already peaked. But it wasn't until week 4 that I started to see crazy results. So I had 3 microcosms, and in microcosm 3, I woke up and found it was around 6 snails, which I was surprised to see because I didn't introduce them in the beginning. And within a week, those snails had doubled. Whether they were laying eggs or they were just hatching, I don't know. But it was very interesting to see. I was a little concerned about the plant life in the jar after that, though. 10 snails in such a small jar, I wasn't sure if it would be enough to support the food needs of the snail. So the fairy shrimp that I had introduced in the beginning, they also looked like they had possibly been reproducing. I don't know if they were other shrimp in the jars that were in the mud, and there's a possibility they were. And there were also other organisms that were popping up in the jars that I had not introduced in the beginning, or I had introduced in the beginning, but I had not thought I had introduced. And this included species that looked like aphids that I know that weren't aphids, but resembled aphids. There were what appeared to be freshwater hydras. There was one dragonfly larvae, which concerned me for the shrimp's sake. I wasn't sure how long the shrimp would last with that apex predator in the jar. And in one of the jars, an algae film had started to form around the jar, which was concerning because it severely impeded viewing what was inside the jar. So I kind of had to look at Microcosm 1 as a loss because I was unable to open the jar for the project. Taking notes on Microcosm 1 was almost impossible. That being said, Microcosm 2 experienced tunnels within the dirt. I wasn't able to identify what it was that was making these tunnels, but it was reminiscent of kind of like an ant farm, and it was kind of interesting to see, and each day there would be more and more tunnels. So these are a couple of pictures that I was able to take. Once again, it was with an iPhone. I know it's not the best quality, but at the top left, you're able to see that dragonfly larvae. In the bottom left, there's that freshwater hydra. Kind of looks like a head scratcher. There's a little picture of one of the snails, and then on the right side, you're able to see the beginnings of those tunnels that I was talking about. In week 5, I made I wouldn't say a mistake, but the idea that I wanted to control the temperature was out the window. So on Halloween Day, I woke up to a frightful sight, I'll say. Frost had kind of covered the ground, which wouldn't have been a problem, but the window that the jars were sitting next to, I guess wasn't insulated well enough, or maybe it was, and whatever. But the jars took a brunt of it, and as you can see from this photo, my shrimp did not make it. It looked like they had all kind of floated to the surface, and it was kind of a sad thing to see. I was a little afraid at this point that I'd kind of done irreparable damage to my microcosms, and I had hoped that some organisms in the jars were still alive. So in week 6, I was able to notice some of the aphid creatures in the jar, so it kind of gave me some hope. But I did notice a decline in plant life. As you can see from the picture on the right, the plants didn't look right. They didn't look green. They kind of looked like little shells of their former selves. And then during week 7, I think stagnation had really kind of taken its toll. We started to see more algae covering the tops of the jars and the sides. And you can kind of notice the water, it almost looked to be getting darker. And I don't know what that was from. I wasn't sure if it was from the cold, but I could notice the water seemed to be getting darker. In the final week of the project, I think life had kind of ceased to exist inside the jars. I know you can kind of see in the picture at the top of the jar, not in the water, you can notice a lot of the organisms just stuck to the side of the jar. And you can't really see that well here, but those lighter colored spots on the bed of mud are actually organisms as well. So we could see carcasses everywhere. The plants seem to have gone, completely non-existent. And I wasn't sure if anything was really still alive in the jars at this point. I guess there's a chance that some of the organisms are still alive and they're in a hibernative state. But with the continued temperature drop, I don't know how much longer that would really last. So there are a couple findings that I made with the experiment, and the first was temperature sensitivity. We saw what happened when frost happened. We got to see how a lot of the organisms had died. It looked like the plants had been stunted, and that leads us to our second finding, which is plant life viability. Without plants, it seemed like everything in the jar ceased to exist. And we know that plants kind of are at the center of a lot of life cycles. The third finding was stagnation. And in week 7, we got to see stagnation in its full effect. We got to see the films of algae forming at the tops, which probably blocked a lot of the light as well for a lot of the plant life. Really kind of inhibiting really the life cycle. The fourth thing is this microcosm showed how fragile an ecosystem can be. Yes, it's much smaller. Yes, I may have let it, freeze, but we got to see a very close up of really a lot of the issues that happen in larger ecosystems. And the last thing was what happens to organisms. And in this case, we looked at temperature as a contributing factor to a lot of their deaths. But I'm sure there was some predation happening. We got to see in jar 2 that tunnels were being made. So, yeah. Overall, this experiment showed us really the balance of an ecosystem. And also what happens to organisms in a confined space. So, was my hypotheses right? Well, yes and no. I did expect life to be centered around the plants, and I expected a boom of life. And that did occur. Around week 4, we got to see an explosion of life. My second hypothesis, and while I expected life to die off, I didn't believe it to be my fault. I anticipated evaporation to be more of a killer rather than temperature change. So, yes and no. That being said, I would love to do it again and really have a more controlled temperature. So, like many experiments, you really want to do as many trials as possible. So for this project, we were asked to find 3 concepts that related to the course. And the first thing that came to mind was community ecology. So in ecology, a community refers to a population of different species interacting in the same area, and I think a microcosm is the perfect example of that. It's just a smaller scale. So in the jars, we got to see plants. We got to see, the hydra. We got to see the shrimp. We got to see the dragonfly larvae. And they all interacted, forming kind of a microcosm community. That leads us into the second concept, and that's species interaction. And like I said before, we got to see all kinds of interactions. Notably, the snails. They were devouring the plants. There was predation happening. We saw the presence of tunnels, all kinds of things. The last topic I wanted to touch on was climate. We got to see what happens when a small shift in temperature occurs. And it really kind of puts the idea of climate change under a microscope. This was just a small change in temperature, and it affected the whole jar. Now, what happens on a larger scale when we see climate change? It really makes you wonder. So there are a couple hypotheses that I would love to test after this. The first is a more controlled temperature. I think I've said this multiple times, but I think this experiment would have went a lot different if I was able to control the temperature better. The second is alternative plant species. I don't know whether this was the right food source for a lot of the organisms in the jar, and I don't know whether the plants that I put in the jar were producing too much oxygen. It's hard to predict. And the last thing is I would love to see, come springtime, whether some of the organisms in the jar are still alive. This would kind of prove my hibernation hypotheses, and it wouldn't make me feel as bad. So, improvements for future projects. I think that, once again, controlling the temperature better. A more detailed monitoring. There was a couple of weekends where I wasn't able to really monitor the jars. I was kind of away with work. Diversifying the plant species and maybe even the organisms within the jar. Being in such proximity to New York City, I wonder if the quality of the water is subpar, and even the pH levels. If I was able to maintain those, maybe I would have had a different outcome. And also just an extended period of observation. If I was able to do this for, say, 16 weeks or 20 weeks, what would be the outcome? And then lastly, replication. We always want to do an experiment as many times as possible. There's a chance that I will get different results if I were to do this 100 times. Many of you are probably wondering what I did with the microcosm now that we're finished with the project. Well, there's a picture. No, I'm kidding. I haven't done anything with the microcosms. That is just mushroom coffee. And lastly, this is a slide of some of the references I used for this project. I went into bottled big scale ecology, kind of shows the pros and cons of microcosms. I also used microcosms experiments can inform ecological problems, and it kind of shows the trends of ecology, and then also the textbook. So I hope you guys had as much fun as I did with this experiment, and I'm looking forward to seeing your guys' results as well. I wonder if it was just me and my negligence that led to the results that I got. So that being said, yeah, that's it.